Hi, my name's Alan Jones, and on behalf of the organising committee of ESPRit, I'm delighted to welcome you all to another of our ESPRit online seminars, and especially, of course, to welcome the two speakers, Jelena Lalatović and MICHAEL LÖRCH. Before I introduce them formally, can I just say a few words about this seminar and the small cluster of seminars that will follow. The next one, I think, will be on the 19th of December. Because this is the first on the theme of periodicals and the law. Now, it occurred to us around 2019, particularly at a conference that we organised at the National Library in Athens and Pantheon University in 2019, that a number of scholars were working right across the continent on issues surrounding illustration and the migration of illustration across transnational borders, and the sorts of issues that they raised, in particular issues, of course, of taste and of what was morally admissible under certain regimes across the continent. And that there were a number of research projects, including Iulia Cuțăpânagu's in Athens, Nora's team in Bochum, and many others as well, that were working on this area. And it raises more than issues of taste and cultural context. In a very immediate sense, it raised questions about law and about what was legal in different jurisdictions across the continent, and indeed beyond the continent. I think the colonial dimension of this is also very instructive when one considers, for example, the Vernacular Press Act of late 19th century India, which were specifically focused on particular language groups for repression and censorship. I also understand that our colleagues over in Paris, Transfer Press, are organising a symposium in the new year on the censorship of the foreign language press in France, and I think other European countries as well. So there's a lot going on across the continent in relation to this theme. The aim of the seminars, of this cluster of seminars within the ESPRit online seminar series, then, is to try and bring some of these colleagues together to see, what kind of work we're doing, what sort of methodologies come into play, and whether we can, consult, compare, contrast our work. And core to this, I think, is when not just images, but the entire legal context of the production of print culture across and within European countries in the 19th century and across those countries is really central to understanding how print culture evolves and changes over time. And so that really is what we're trying to get to grips with over the next few weeks with these seminars. I've been asked by Iulia Cuțăpânagu, by the way, to apologize for her absence today. She's one of the instigators of this series. And she wants us all to know that she's, as I speak, marching through Athens to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Great Polytechnian student uprising against the Greek military junta, which led, of course, to the collapse of the junta some 8 months later in July 1974. If she can get a signal on the phone, she'll be listening in. If not, she will catch us up later, and she's asked me to send her apologies. Just a few housekeeping issues before I hand over to our speakers. Please make sure that your mics are on mute whilst the speakers are speaking. The papers themselves are being recorded, but not the question and answer and discussion session at the end. Please do use chat, so the chat function, should you wish to ask a question during the presentation. So we'll try and pick them up towards the end. Between us, Nora and I will catch most of them, I hope. So please do that. The papers will last about 15 minutes each, and that should leave us with about 20 to 25 minutes for discussion at the end of the session, and we plan to end on top of the hour. So, on to our speakers, who, as you will see, have placed, censorship, press regulation, the legal context of the production of periodicals absolutely center stage in their papers today. Our two speakers then will follow each other are Jelena Lalatović, who is based in Belgrade. Her PhD thesis focused on genres of literary criticism and polemic in the student periodical press, the oppositional public sphere from 1937 to 1968 at the University of Belgrade. She's now working on a monograph based on that thesis. Together with Dr. Daria Bohemia, she has been organizing a conference on the theme Between Distant and Close Reading, Periodical Studies and Humanities in the 21st Century. And a field of interest includes cultural and literary studies more broadly, as well as political and intellectual history and its impact on literature. She now works as a research assistant at the Institute for Literature and Art in Belgrade. So welcome, Jelena. MICHAEL LÖRCH is a researcher and translator based in Strasbourg. His recently finished PhD thesis was on the politics of the scholarly journal, and he followed the links between academia, the publishing industry, and politics. He's now working on a monograph, again, based on his doctoral research, and is completing an article on the Anglophone press in 19th century Germany. He's worked as a research assistant at the Gemeinschaftsstand campus at the Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz, and his areas of interest include periodical studies and the role of politics and economics in modern and contemporary North American literature. So welcome to you both, Jelena and MICHAEL. And now, Jelena, I'm handing over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm only too happy to be here to present a year-long research on censorship and its impact on the morphology of the left-wing press before the Second World War in Yugoslavia. Today, I'm going to speak about a remarkable periodical of a remarkably short longevity of 5 months, whose effect on further cultural and literary history, I believe, was noteworthy. Before I proceed to the matter, I would like to briefly reflect on to put it that way, disciplinarian meta-challenges. I defended my doctoral thesis in periodical studies dealing with a vast corpus of texts in intellectual and political history. However, the main topic is limited to the Yugoslav heritage and Serbo-Croatian language. Therefore, periodical studies function, at least for me, as a framework which enables me to analyze historical matter in theoretical terms. The significant portion of my research has been conducted in the archives. So over the years, due to my background in philology, I couldn't help but kept asking myself if a philological perspective in the archival research brings something new, or at least authentic. It is specifically important when we deal with the censorship, the problem of censorship, and a physical destruction of texts it encompasses. Censorship is not restricted to the ideological struggle solely, as the case of the interwar Yugoslavian society shows. When we refer to censorship in the Yugoslav context, it is mostly associated with the Tito's regime and the post-war socialist republic. We can often encounter the opinion that Tito's regime was equally brutal towards its left-wing opponents as the monarchist regime in the interwar Yugoslavia was towards its democratic and communist adversaries. I think the cases such as this of August Cesarec, a prominent author and the editor of a periodical I'm speaking about today. This case particularly, and his campaign against the state repression initiated in 1928, demonstrate that that kind of drawing a parallel between two systems is profoundly wrong. As I previously mentioned, in 1928, a prominent Yugoslav writer, August Cesarec, issued a newspaper, The Protection of a Human, an Independent Herald for Human and Civil Rights, aimed at campaigning against the law for the protection of the state, whose main goal was to curb free speech and freedom of expression in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. The newspaper, The Protection of a Human, thus represents the first periodical of this genre, entirely dedicated to a single cause, which is generally rare, but this is the first kind this is the first periodical of this kind in the history of Yugoslav periodicals. August Cesarec was one of the champions of the communist movement and one of the most distinguished modernist voices in the Yugoslav literature. During the Second World War, he refused to renounce his communist stance and to collaborate with the fascist regime in the occupied territory, eventually dying as its victim. However, as the editor of The Protection of a Human, he insists on speaking from the authorial point of view. As a man of letters, he feels the urge to speak up against political imprisonment, advocating for freedom of expression. The campaign against the law for the protection of the state demanded the following: abolishing this law, guaranteeing the freedom of expression for every individual, regardless of their ethnicity, class, and party affiliation, and last but not least, one of its aims was to organize both moral and financial support for, as Cesarec puts it, the victims of lawlessness. The names of the imprisoned were regularly published and updated in almost every issue. The essential contribution of The Protection of a Human to the intellectual history is the fact that it articulated argument that there cannot be the freedom of press as long as political persecutions persist. Moreover, the police state and the era of Inquisition, as the editor of The Protection of a Human referred to the process of interrogation, which included severe torture, are understood and depicted as a direct result of anti-communist and anti-unionist stance. Before political imprisonment applied to democratic deputies and non-communist activists and intellectuals, it was workers and unionists who were brutally tortured and denied freedom because of their class or simply socialist convictions. Cesarec keeps reminding the readership about the case of a textile woman worker who died under torment while being accused of stealing 24 meters of fabric, and it was in 1924. The editor's rhetoric is straightforward yet complex. He does not openly side with the communist movement, but he emphasizes that the free speech could never be achieved by winning it through insisting on not being a communist. Here, he relies on Marx's ideas in the Prussian censorship, who says that the law against the frame of mind is not a law of the state promulgated for its citizens, but the law of one party against another party. The law which punishes tendency abolishes the equality of the citizens before the law. It is a law which divides, not one which unites. And all laws which divide are reactionary. It is not a law, but a privilege. One may do what another may not do, not because the latter lacks some objective quality, like a minor in regard to concluding contracts. No, because his good intentions and his frame of mind are under suspicion. The moral state assumes its members to have the frame of mind of the state, even if they act in opposition to an organ of the state, against the government. but in a society in which one organ imagines itself the sole, exclusive possessor of state reason and state morality, in a government which opposes the people in principle and hence regards its anti-state frame of mind as the general, normal frame of mind, the bare conscience of affection events laws against tendency, laws of revenge, laws against a frame of mind which has its seat only in the government members themselves. So here is the extract from Marx and how it was printed in the protection of human under the title "The Freedom of the Press and the Censorship." So the crucial contribution of the protection of a human to the further cultural history is the fact that it encapsulated the idea that the freedom of the workers' movement is a guarantee of a universal freedom. It will become the pillar of the patriotic and anti-fascist mobilization in the 30s. At first, I had the impression that this periodical is unprecedented in the history of the periodical press in Yugoslavia. However, its appearance and rhetorical strategies relied on the periodical name, The Free Word, which was published in the early 1920s as a newsletter of the Socialist Party, a split from the Communist Party. It is not a conundrum, though. The Communist and the Socialist Party split over the strategic divergence because the socialist current believed that a socialist society could be achieved through the parliamentary struggle and gradual change of laws, while the communist current, put it simply, advocated for a revolutionary instead of this evolutionary approach. Due to the fact that the protection of a human was dedicated to a parliamentary cause and the change of the law enforcement practices, it had to build on this socialist tradition of championing workers and human rights within the legal framework. In the majority of the communist traditions, these two currents have been regarded as purely oppositional. However, the campaign against the state repression from 1928 is a point of their, I would say, fruitful encounter. To understand how this campaign influenced the development of the left-wing press, we need to elaborate on the main features of the censorship in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. First and foremost, it made no distinction between fictitious and other type of text. As an illustration, they banned the sensational novel in sequels published in a daily newspaper because it depicted banditry in a positive manner, with an excuse that it would incite people to rebellion. Or furthermore, they would ban Armenian novel Musadag under the excuse that the way it portrays Muslims could influence the ethnic tensions between Slavic nations and the Bosnian Muslims. The code words or pretexts for subjugation to censorship were the protection of the state and some kind of offensive. It much more relied on the police and physical force, both against people and publications, than on courts and fake trials, as it was the case under the post-war regime. So this type of censorship, which Cesarec, I believe, justly labeled as proto-fascist, aimed at physical destruction of adversaries, while the censorship in the states of so-called existing socialism was rooted in the struggle for interpretation and ideological legitimacy, leaning on fabricated trials and judiciary. Hence, the parallels between these two systems are usually more obstructive than helpful in understanding the very mechanisms of repression and censorship. While the visual aspects of the press are of a symbolic value, texts bear the significance of the embodiment. So the protection of a human, an independent herald for human and civil rights, initiated and edited by a modernist writer who obviously understood this, set an example and a role model for the left-wing press in the following decade. The crucial narrative and rhetorical strategies they inherited from the Cesarec enterprise are the central role of the reportage as a genre, specifically reporting on social injustice. Additionally, it is the idea of the list of the names that needs to be memorized as a memento of the mass movement, originating as a form of defiance against a system of censorship and mass torments and executions. These strategies remain vital morphological traits of the left-wing press until the end of the Second World War. So here on the left, you can see a cover from the newspaper Student, which was the main newsletter of anti-fascist students organization at the University of Belgrade in the interwar period. And this cover is entirely dedicated to the people, student activists who were either wounded or killed by the police in the mass demonstration. Just to illustrate the point how impactful and influential the enterprise of the protection of a human was. So a comprehensive understanding of these concepts requires a focused examination of the text, or in other words, a philological inquiry. So here I build on the Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht thesis of a philological inquiry as a quest for presence. The idea that physical transcendence and curatorship of the text also bear the meaning. So this is not my personal war on the archival clerks who always try to push me to take the photos of the materials, while I prefer to read them either in a physical form or at least as copies. Because Gumbrecht's idea of philology as a desire for presence actually could be used to explain certain periodical genre and forms as a form of memento, which conveys the meaning encapsulated in the material shape of a handwritten or a printed text. Here, I would just like to give one or two remarks, because Gumbrecht uses the word power not in a Foucauldian sense, but a power as ability or capability of taking up the physical space. And I appreciate this idea because it actually showcases that the logic of a philological examination, this long desire for the material side of the press and of the text and its presence actually coincides with the logic of the press and the printed cultures of the mass movement in the 20th century. Because as now we can read this periodical genre, reportage, or those lists of the names as forms of memento, which they were actually aimed at. So yeah, here I would stop, and we can discuss these methodological issues later. And I would like to now give the floor to Michael. Thank you very much for your attention.
Today, I'd like to talk about censorship in the German Democratic Republic, which is, this paper is basically derived from my recent dissertation work, where I was researching the scholarly journal of humanities, the Zeitschrift für Anglistik und Amerikanistik, or Journal for English and American Studies, which was quite the opposite of the short-lived one we just saw, because it was created in 1953 and it still exists today. So it's very long-lived, which is characteristic for many scholarly journals. And this paper, and this I was not, during the dissertation, I was not focused explicitly on the legal framework. So this presentation here now gave me the possibility to put this all into a connection, which was quite interesting, because I was not only in researching this particular journal, but also the scholarly journal, like in an historical point of view. And I saw that many of these censorship mechanisms that I saw in the GDR basically go very, very far back. So we have this kind of licenses which remind of the privilege of the royal privileges that were granted in the Enlightenment period. So it's, yeah. What I will do today is I will first look at the censorship in the German Democratic Republic, looking at the legal frame, see how that what built the basis for these various systems. Then I will look how the daily press was controlled, how the books were controlled, because these were two very different apparatuses which were created, especially contrasting it to magazines and journals. And then in the end, I will have a quick look at the Zeitschrift from Christian Amerikanistik, and especially one incident in the 1970s, which shows how these mechanisms were at work and how this played out, like behind the scenes. So first of all, in the Constitution of 1949, when the state was founded, it basically took the same clause that was already in the Constitution of the Weimar Republic, decreeing the freedom of the press, however, within the limit of the laws, which is something we can still find today in most constitutions, which basically abolish pre-censorship, which was the standard in most of the 17th and 19th century. And it was very explicit, probably under the impression of Nazi Germany and everything that came before, in saying that there shall be no censorship of the press. However, of course, we can imagine that the disparity between what was written in the Constitution and what really went on was quite important. This becomes evident when we look, for example, what within the limits of these laws actually meant. Because when looking at the criminal code, we had the Article 106 on anti-state agitation, which was also called sometimes the rubber paragraph, because it contained this term of anti-state agitation, which is an extremely indeterminate legal concept. And the closest we get to an definition is the discrimination against the state, the political, economic, or social conditions of the German Democratic Republic. So we can see this is leaves a lot of room for interpretation. Then there was a second constitution, so about 20 years later. Here we can see the freedom of the press was moved from Article 9 to Article 27 already. And there are two important things that have changed here. First of all, the phrase "within the limits of the laws" was changed to "in accordance with the principles of this constitution," which is to be understood when looking at another article which precedes this one, namely Article 18, which enshrines the socialist national culture as the foundation for a socialist society. So the difference between before is that now this freedom of the press is already meant being aligned with state socialism. The other important difference is that the second part of this article has changed significantly because the word censorship has been avoided. Now they don't say there's no censorship, but they say the freedom of the press, radio, and television shall be guaranteed. This is quite interesting because it is reflective of a sort of code of euphemisms that has been created and became standard until 1989, actually, which has been researched by Bradley in 2010 already, who has identified 4 distinct strands. And Bradley, she worked on theater censorship, but what she found here is I came across all of these terms frequently when researching periodicals. So yeah, what is interesting here is she saw 4 distinct strands where these terms or these euphemisms were derived from. One part was from planned economy, from the economical sphere. So we have terms like planning, management, steering, which were also used to control the contents of especially newspapers. So there was a lot of talk about the plans, what they should have to fulfill, which we should include. And the word proportions was something which comes up a lot, and which I will come back later when we're looking at the example from the ZAA. Then the other part was derived from administrative language. We have terms like approval procedures, instruction, administrative measures, which is, I would say, still quite common. What is more interesting are these points 3 and 4, because they show how this hypocrisy, how this disparity between the reality and what was described in the law was basically played out. Because the officials or the SAD functionaries, they perceive themselves as not as censors, but as facilitators and protectors of culture, specifically against imperialist corruption. But and they also saw themselves as pedagogues. So they have a lot of terms like processes of ideological clarification, of patient convincing of editors or writers, of providing help and support, or of self-criticism. And interesting here is that this is almost never used cynically. And I came across these terms or this whole perception in a multitude of files in the archive and also in interviews that former members of this apparatus gave. And they saw themselves almost as like a wise and omniscient parent who has to rein in their rebellious children from time to time for their own good. And there was one interview with a former employee of the censorship authority who basically described her work as that of a midwife who would work together with the writers and the editors to bring the text to publication. So, and this all, of course, were ways of describing this censorship and control. Now I quickly wanted to show how this played out in these various domains of print culture. The most restricted, the most controlled one was the daily press, which probably goes back to Lenin's proclamation of the press as or collective organizers. Here we have this planning of content, which was very extreme here. There was this saying that in local newspapers, my opinion is coming in from Berlin at 2 o'clock. So there was quite strict in what they could print and were supposed to print, even if it was not as strict as what we saw in Nazi Germany, where they basically copied what Berlin was saying to them. Then it played out in preferential treatment of party-affiliated newspapers who were always preferred, especially concerned this last point here of the allocation of paper, printing capacities, and foreign currency, which were all centralized and firmly in the hands of the Socialist Unity Party. Then we had these licenses, which guaranteed a sort of pre-censorship. So if you wanted to publish a newspaper, you had to apply for an official license. Which is very close to what I said before, to this privilege system what we had in absolutist Europe, where you had to obtain a royal privilege in order to be able to be allowed to publish. What is also special about the daily press, why it is the most strict, because we had evaluation departments at the Central Committee and the press office, which allowed for a type of Nachzensur or post-censorship. So they could intervene, even if it was not systematically done. Very different. This played out very differently in the book sector, which was a part that I looked, which was very important for my dissertation, because here again we have licenses. First for the publishing houses. So if they wanted to re-enter the playing field, so to say, because after 45, every publication activity had to cease on order of the Allied powers. And then those who were allowed to re-enter were, of course, closely monitored. Then there was a central authority which changed names repeatedly. I've just put on 3 here. I think there were overall 5 or 6, which is reflective of the fact that this authority was one of the most unstable in the history of the GDR, and it took almost 2 decades to consolidate. And so it was subject to political fluctuations. There was an extreme overlap of competencies. In some cases, and with some publishers, there were up to 4 or 5 different institutions involved. And it shows that this sector was very important to the Central Committee, who intervened regularly. How this played out, there was a sort of pre-censorship in the form of print permits. So every book that wanted to be published needed to apply for a permit. This was done in the form of an entire dossier usually, which contained a form sheet with basic data and evaluation by the publisher, and usually 1 or 2 external assessments. So it was of up to 10, 20 pages sometimes, which effectively decentralized this censorship. Because of these applications, I think maybe about 5% or even less were actually refused, because the publishers would not do this entire lengthy process if there was a risk that it wouldn't be published. However, there was also, and even these print permits, given this prohibition of censorship, there was never any printed or official guidelines. And only in 1960s, there were the guidelines for the assessment, which were created, which kind of gave a frame of what this print permit should include. However, even this document was never official. It was never handed out entirely. It was usually communicated verbally to the publishers and to editors, or in sections at least. Nonetheless, this allowed for a certain flexibility and a certain professionalization, because in the end, it were these external assessments were written by people involved in the book publication. So there were strategies developing how you could make a certain book pass, which is too much to go into here. With periodicals, there was some similarities to the daily press. However, there were no required topics, at least at the ones that I looked at, the scholarly periodicals. They could do more or less what they wanted to, of course, knowing that there would be consequences if they went too far overboard, but there wouldn't be any proportions given centrally. Post-censorship was only happening very sporadically, and mostly in times of political restriction. For example, after the uprisings in Budapest, there were a number of editors who were removed or replaced, but this was very rare and usually concerned political periodicals, which took more on the spotlight. However, we had this license system, which was quite complex. So in order to publish a journal, you would have to lay down why you what readership this journal would serve, what would be the how this journal would contribute to the construction of the socialist society and so on. And of course, by signing this, by being granted this license, they would affirm that they would adhere to the legal context, to the constitution of the country. What is important is that the domain of periodicals was rather an unwanted domain. So sometimes it was the central authority for books, sometimes it was the press office. It was moved around quite a bit, and they never really wanted it because they had rather tight budgets. Usually they didn't have much personnel, so it was always something that tried to avoid. So here it is very extreme that we have this decentralization taking place, which is interesting in a country which is as centralized as the German Democratic Republic was, and which really relied on self-censorship because people were basically afraid, especially given that there was no concrete context, no concrete basis. So they had to assume what higher-ups would like to see or not like to see. And in the case of periodicals, it were mostly the publishers who were responsible for what was happening in the journal. I'm almost over time, so I'm just looking at the example that I found how this took place. So here in 1975, there was a letter from the publisher to the editorial secretary of the Zeitschrift von Anglistik und Mechanistik, and the publisher noted that the proportions of noteworthy literature appearing in the review part, the proportion is not correct, and that only 3 out of 15 review titles in the rest issues represented socialist literature, meaning literature from socialist countries. And he remarked especially that the number of review titles from West Germany were twice as high as those from the GDR and other socialist countries. and even came to the conclusion that we should manage the large offer of West German reviewers' copies, a number that is certainly no coincidence, in such a way as to not create the false impression that the Federal Republic was the focus of East German linguistic and linguistic research. Here, as I said before, there's no indication that there was actually any sort of given centrally prescribed proportions for these review sections of academic journals. So it was more the fear of the publisher, especially this was happening at the time where a new restriction phase was announcing itself. So it was probably the publisher trying to play it carefully. Interesting is how the editorial secretary applied to this. First of all, he said that we will seriously discuss your suggestion and make an effort to change the proportions in future issues. So we have this relationship of being guided on the right direction. However, he then shows that he does not agree and gives quite a lot of arguments for this, especially concerning the number of professorships in American studies in West Germany at the time and in East Germany, so which made it unavoidable to have a higher percentage. And then especially in the end, which shows that they try to find the room or enlarge the room for interpretation that they had. Because he notably said, "You have taken out the review of Honigmann, Chef weist an. It was admittedly rather critical, but you will have noted that I removed or attenuated some phrases. I accept your proposition, but am I to understand that we should consider it a general directive not to say anything negative about GDR productions?" Which is interesting because it was said in a very sarcastic tone. So he addresses directly this non-existence / existence of censorship in this letter, in this discussion with his publisher. And he even goes so far as using this title of the reviewed book, which translates to something like chief commands or chief orders, which I see as another quip at the cost of the publisher. And yeah, and he could do this at this point. I couldn't go too much into that because this journal had gained by that time a certain international visibility, which was also wanted by the Socialist Unity Party. They wanted to present themselves as a country of science, of academic prowess. So the editor knew that they had some room for discussion here. And in the end, there was a editorial board meeting that followed, where they did actually decide to correct these proportions and to include more socialist literature, which, however, when we look at the actual review section that followed, did never happen, actually went the other way around. Okay, so thank you for listening.